My name is Kevin Turner. If I'm not wearing an Arsenal shirt, can you really be sure it's me? My task tonight is to talk to you a little bit about the MCQ items, what we call the multiple choice questions, usually talking about them as items, maybe an item set, and then the answers, we usually talk about them in terms of responses. And so I will shamelessly hold up my hand and admit that I copied Annalisa's great ideas in terms of this agenda slide. What are we going to expect? What do kids need to know and be able to do? Talking, as the chief mentioned earlier, about those MCQ sets, talking about parallelisms that we build into the MCQ items and the responses for those questions. Especially talking a little bit about distractors. We always say there's no such thing as a trick question. We're not trying to trick a good student into a bad response, but we do build distractors into the items because we do want to make sure, especially in the context of vocabulary and key terms, things like acculturation and assimilation, very similar words, but they mean very different things. So we'll talk a little bit about distractors. The chief always talks about explain the degree to which. And for me, my kids, as soon as I say that, they start, moving their arms back and forth like this, understanding the high degree, the low degree. By the way, it could be no degree. So we have to think about how those special skills will work, but not in the context of the FRQ. Increasingly, you're starting to see a couple of times in the 60 items of the MCQ that there may be some explain the degree to which in there as well. And then, of course, as Annalisa said, practice, practice, practice. Practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. So I always tell students, believe it or not, the more questions you see right now and miss, that's a good thing, because it creates for you a list of things that you need to go study. Maybe you get your hands on that big ideas book that everybody talks about, right? That is a great way to study, but you don't know what you need to do until you start saying, well, I took this practice test and I missed these 30, 40 items. All right, now you know what you need to go do. So in terms of what to expect, the chief already covered this a little bit. The only thing I'll really highlight here is that time is a valuable resource. And I really struggle with my own students on this, and perhaps you will find a way to get your kids to understand. It's 60 items and it's 60 minutes. So if you are grinding for 2-3 minutes on an item and you end up getting that wrong, those 2 or 3 minutes would be better served seeing, 3-4 other items that you might get right. So when we talk about the 60 items in 60 minutes, this is something that you can practice with your students, maybe set a timer in class, maybe, go through that experience with them so that they understand what that feels like, 60 minutes or a minute per item. AP Classroom is great for this because there's now a really cool feature when you start sharing the data with your students. It'll show them how long they spent on each of those items. And that's really actionable data that they can work on. There's no penalty for guessing. This is an exam where if you leave it blank, it's going to be wrong. But if you bubble something in, it might be right. And this is where I tell my students, I don't want you randomly guessing 20, 25 times. But if you're down to 5 or 6 and you know that the clock is running out, let's go ahead and pick a letter of the day and let's bubble that letter maybe 5, 6 times. Again, you're more likely to get at least 1, maybe 2 of them right if you're consistent with your letter. But again, this is not, I don't want to encourage them to be guessing all the way through, but at the same time, understand that don't leave it blank. And we do see sometimes, not just MCQ, but also FRQ, kids will turn in just complete blank pages, and we don't want that. Increasingly, the test, ever since the CED came along and the excellent work that some of my colleagues did on that document, again, it's very transparent. It's very predictable. We want your kids to be successful, like the chief said. So we took away the things like negative stems. All of these are except. We don't have any of the tricky stems where it leads you in one direction and then suddenly careens you back the other way. The items are straightforward. They're oftentimes very, very key terms based. Many times you will see a synonym for one of our key term vocabulary words in the stem. And it's, sometimes you guys will realize words in our class are sometimes married to each other. If you're talking about agglomeration, you're very often going to see the word clustering. So if you see an MCQ stem and it talks about clustering, if a student is really well prepared on the vocabulary, they're going to look at that and it's almost like ding, 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 ding. Oh, clustering. I know that's agglomeration. Now let me make sure, let me read through my question stem and let me go and look at my responses. When we write test items, all of our test items are written from the essential knowledge statements that are in your CED. So if you are using that CED the way that College Board would like us to, you know that every daily topic, right? As part of the 7 units of study, each topic has 1 EK or sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 EKs. The multiple choice question stems are going to come from those essential knowledge statements. It's almost like when you look at the CED, the left side of the slide is the question and the right side is the answer. So we actually start with that EK answer and then we'll formulate the question based on that. All course skills will appear somewhere in the exam. So now this is not so much the topic, it's the other parts, the skill part. Again, go into your CED, there's a fantastic section that shows you all of that, all of those skill sets. They will appear either on the MCQ or on the FRQ. And again, here's something the chief also is a big proponent of this one. It's a great idea. Take some of these old released FRQs. You could even go back to some of them that are older than the new CED that are not in the ABCDEFG 7.5 command verb format and reconstruct those, let the kids unpack them and take them apart and rearrange them into MCQ items. And that's a great way to practice. We'll do that on the next slide here. Elodie, please. Sorry, 2 slides away. Don't let me lie to you. Item sets. Let me cover this real quick, and then we'll play around with some illustrations. 6 to 8 times out of the 60 items, your students are going to encounter what we call item sets. They could have 2 members, or they could have 3. So in other words, could be 2 questions, could be 3 questions. Somewhere between 18 and 24 total items on the test, on the MCQ side, are going to be stimulus-based, right? Map, chart, graph. Satellite imagery is a very popular thing nowadays. These are the kinds of things you want to give your kids rich examples to deal with stimulus. The set members require the use of the stimulus. In other words, the student should not be able to answer the question without referring to the graph, to the map, to the image. Okay. Now, the third member in the set might have a tenuous applicability to the stimulus. In other words, it may be something theoretical, maybe based on a model, maybe based on something that we teach the students in terms of maybe demographic transition, maybe something like Rostow's stages of development. So that third set member, because remember, like the chief said, we're putting these into a scaffolding order. Now that's the next little part here. Be careful. That doesn't mean that a 3-item set is going to be a member that is emerging, proficient, and advanced. It could be 2 emergings and a proficient. It could be 2 proficients and an advanced. So we will always scaffold it like that, but it doesn't mean easy, medium, hard. Again, let your kids know what to expect. Sometimes when we take away that anxiety and the fear of the unknown, it empowers kids to perform better. So here is an old FRQ, and if you need to, you can kind of zoom in there, and certainly on the recording, you can go back and freeze this and maybe watch it again. In the interest of time, I'm going to go quickly. This is an old question that was about infant mortality rate. And obviously, look at your legend, look at your key. You can see that the darker color is going to have a higher infant mortality. The lighter color is lower. And notice that I circled the vocab, the action verbs that the chief did a great job talking about. Which of these describes the pattern that's shown on the map? So this was actually an old FRQ, but we've turned it into an MCQ stimulus, and we've written a question based on that. great opportunity for kids to practice. And of course, the kids should arrive at the idea that C, the lowest levels of infant mortality are those in Europe, right? So now the next member in our set might be something a little bit harder here. So we're moving up maybe to a proficient or even an advanced skill. Which of the following best explains the levels of infant mortality within South Asia? So now we're going to be zooming in. I'm looking at India. I'm looking at Pakistan, looking at Bangladesh. Note that this second question, they have to incorporate map skills. Now that's unit 1. That's not necessarily unit 2 about population statistics, but one thing we also need to remember to tell the kids, unit 1 skills are embedded throughout the test. Things like scale of analysis, things like, looking at generalized patterns and choropleth maps versus distribution versus proportional symbols and those kinds of things. So here we're looking for an explanation, and what we want to be able to talk about is how or why. And so infant mortality is going to be higher because, did you hear Annalisa really talk about because? We really believe that a student can never earn credit on an FRQ response unless they use the word because in that explanation. Otherwise, it's almost always going to be an incomplete answer. But we can also practice that same thing with the MCQs. And then finally, the third set member here, and now it's our special skill. So it's our explain the degree to which. And so now we got the arms going back and forth from low to high. Which of the following best describes best explains the degree to which infant mortality is related to economic development? So now we want to know, is there a connection between those things? As a country moves through its developmental process, does infant mortality come down? We know that there's a lot of connections there, girl education, female empowerment, so many cool things. That's why we love teaching this class, isn't it? So our answer here is E. It's a very high degree of connectivity because the more developed countries, right, they're going to have higher GDP, they're going to have higher GDP per capita, therefore they're going to have much lower infant mortality. Now, parallelisms, I love these. As much as you can, show your students items, and you can go digging through AP Classroom. You can look through the test prep booklets. Annalisa mentioned iScore 5. There's Fiveable. There's so many things that are out there. Show the students some of what we call parallels. Sometimes it's as simple as 2 short responses and 3 long responses. Very often it's in a 2-3 format. Sometimes it's 2, 2, and 1, and sometimes there are diametrically opposed parallels. Sometimes the parallels will be 2 positive, 3 negative. There's all kinds of ways we can build parallelism into the answer options. But again, one thing you're practicing with the students is once they start to identify that they know that it's, all right, I know it's either these 2 or this 3, then already your statistical chance of getting a better score goes up because you're starting to hone in on those parallels and you're saying, I know it's not those 3, though, let's say it's intensive, extensive agriculture. It's not those 3 because this is not intensive. This is extensive. So now I've got a 50-50 shot about the other 2 items that might be about extensive agriculture, right? Now, on some of the advanced items, you're going to start seeing that we've got parallels within parallels with, there's parallelisms going all over the place. A's parallel to E and B's parallel to E also in this sense. And, again, you'll get some examples. Elodie, if you'll advance, I think I found a really obvious one here. And this is from a really, really old MCQ item. Any shout outs to our friends from West Virginia. But it's, talking about the types of maps. And so you'll see that choropleth and cartogram, those are kind of parallels in the sense that they start with a C, they kind of sound similar. You've got 2 of them that have symbol, proportional symbol, dot symbol, and then you've got the word isoline. And, again, you're going to notice that a lot of times these parallels, you're looking at them and you're like, I know Mr. Turner talked about all of these things. You can't really discount anything by saying, I've never heard of that. Generally speaking, if we've done a really good job, tell the students, when you see an answer that you've never heard of, Probably not the right answer. We should have taught it to you if it's in the CED. If you've read your textbook, you should have some recognition. And again, the chief and Annalisa both talked about know your terms. Make sure you know your vocabulary. Here's another example of some parallelisms. And this is, again, an old question, but an ethnic neighborhood, how would we describe it? Notice that the verb, the action verb, identify, describe, define, explain, compare. And notice how three of them talk about communities, right? The bottom two talks about different cities and maybe neighborhoods. We've got some parallelisms running in terms of length. We've got two that are longer, three that are kind of the same length. We don't want kids to look and say, huh, four of these are really long and one's short. I bet it's the short one. We don't want kids thinking those games, right? We want to provide options and parallels where we're testing them on their geographic knowledge, right? Not just on whether they can kind of scam the system and figure out, hey, I think it's this answer B because it's different than all of the other ones. Now, distractors, and this is a lot of challenge for us sometimes as item writers, coming up with compelling distractors that are plausible. Sometimes the chief had a great one of these earlier. It could be a true statement, but it doesn't answer the question that's being asked. So we have to be careful of those. Distractors can sometimes be text-based or vocab-based. They can be homonyms, words that kind of sound alike. They look similar. They might be opposite terms. If I'm asking you, if I'm writing an item and I'm asking about push and pull factors of migration, and I ask you about push factors, what are some of my wrong answers going to be? I'm going to load those up with pull factors because I'm testing you on, do you understand the difference between those factors that cause you to leave and those that are attracting you to somewhere else, maybe farther away? So be ready for those kinds of distractors. Again, sometimes that distractor can totally be a true statement. And it doesn't answer the question though, right? It takes the student off in a tangent. A very common distractor, all right, like I said, is just going opposite of what we're asking. And again, be careful. There is also the fact that sometimes there are two perfectly opposing, diametrically opposed answers, but the answer might be one of the other three. Those two could be there as distractors. And so you might then see, all right, it's going to be something else. Here's an example, and again, it's tough to get some of these off of some of the sources and get them big enough on your screen to be able to show you the stimulus and the items. This is a question a long time ago about coffee production. And you'll notice it's very equatorial, a lot of colonies that were colonized that are producers. We're the big consumers. But this one says, it's talking about the description of the coffee bean production at a global scale. And so it has core periphery, it has hierarchical diffusion, it has tropical latitudes, it has inside arid climate regions, and it has in more developed countries. Well, these are developing countries or less developed. So E is a good distractor because it's the opposite of what we want kids to see. It's not core periphery, but kids know that model. We drill that in. So that's something they say they can't discount it because they're like, wait a second, we learned that. It's not hierarchical. We know that it's within that tropical latitude, and it's not in arid areas because coffee grows in tropical, equatorial, mountainous climates. So, this is one where, again, we've built in some good distractors there. And again, the favorite skill, the special skill, and I put a little asterisk there. The chief discussed this, and I kind of had some inside knowledge that she might be talking about that earlier tonight. So this slide is really just reinforcing that really important lesson that she was talking about. In an MCQ format, we've got 5 responses. And so let's say there's an explain the degree to which STEM. Well, what are we going to do? A, B, C, D, E, right? If we have 5 possible responses, maybe A and B are to a low degree. Maybe C is to a moderate degree, and maybe D and E are to a high degree. So almost immediately, a student who is well prepared, right? Because again, we have questions written at different levels. Some of them are emerging items. Those are kind of determining who's going to, get a 1 or not. And then we've got some proficient items, and those are going to kind of determine where are my 2s and my 3s and all that. And then those really hard questions, those are sorting out my 4s and my 5s. So here I've got my explain agreed, which this is a very challenging skill. So first they've got to recognize, is there a degree here? What is the degree here? And then they've got to discern, all right, there's 2 high degrees. Which one correctly explains why it's a high degree, right? Because again, take practice tests. I'm telling you, I would hope that by now, through the course of the school year, your students have seen hundreds of MCQ items, maybe your classroom-based tests. Maybe you've used the MCQ progress checks that are on AP Classroom. Maybe you've released some of the practice exams that are out there. Maybe the kids have review books, and most all of them have practice tests in the back of them. Maybe they've been online at Fiveable. They can do practice questions every day there. Maybe they downloaded iScore 5. It has 500 multiple choice questions on it. Again, just some really, really awesome resources. I always tell the kids nowadays, no group of students has ever had more access to review materials than the kids have nowadays. Back when we first started teaching this class, we were writing FRQs on the back of a shovel with a piece of chalk. Look at what kids have now. It's a real, real benefit to them. It's not a question of they can or they cannot. They either will or they will not use all these awesome tools.